Sedona, Arizona, September 1954. The sun hangs low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the red rock formations that have witnessed countless human dramas played out against their ancient backdrop. The desert air carries the scent of sage and dust, mixed with the lingering heat that makes evening the most tolerable part of any day spent in this harsh but beautiful landscape. The roadside café sits like a lonely outpost beside Highway 89, its weathered wooden walls and hand-painted signs speaking of simpler times when travel meant adventure rather than mere convenience. A neon sign flickers intermittently in the window, advertising coffee and home-cooked meals to travelers who brave the desert roads between cities separated by vast distances and unforgiving terrain. Inside, the atmosphere reflects the comfortable shabbiness of a place that serves function over form, where linoleum floors and vinyl booth seats provide honest comfort without pretension. The smell of coffee and frying bacon mingles with cigarette smoke and the subtle aroma of desert dust that infiltrates every building in this part of Arizona despite careful maintenance. A radio plays quietly in the background, its country music providing a soundtrack of lonesome highways and broken hearts that seems perfectly suited to the isolation that defines life in the American Southwest. The late afternoon light filters through windows that could use washing, creating geometric patterns on tables where traveling salesmen and local ranchers share the democracy of roadside dining. Glenn Ford sits alone in a corner booth, 38 years old and carrying the accumulated dust and fatigue of another long day filming The Violent Men in the nearby desert locations that have transformed Sedona into an unlikely center of Hollywood Western production. His clothes show the honest wear of practical work rather than costume department precision, and his face bears the weathered look of someone who spends his days in natural sunlight rather than studio illumination. Ford's presence in the café attracts no particular attention from the handful of other customers, most of whom remain absorbed in their own conversations and concerns. His fame, considerable though it may be in Hollywood circles, carries little weight in places where practical competence matters more than screen recognition. Here, he exists simply as another traveler, seeking decent food and quiet restoration after demanding work. If you want to see more stories about Hollywood legends who proved their character through action rather than words, subscribe to Glenn Ford Hidden Legacy. The elderly man working behind the counter moves with the careful economy of someone whose body has absorbed decades of honest labor but whose spirit remains unbroken by the accumulation of small hardships that define working-class life. His white hair and lined face speak of years spent serving others, while his precise movements suggest pride in craft that transcends the modest nature of his work environment. Harry Nakamura has operated the roadside café for 15 years, ever since his discharge from military service that took him from his family's California farm to Pacific battlefields where Japanese-American soldiers proved their loyalty through sacrifice that their country was slow to acknowledge. His establishment serves as both business and refuge, a place where traveling strangers and local regulars find common ground in their appreciation for simple food prepared with genuine care. The peaceful rhythm of the café's evening routine faces disruption when the front door opens with unnecessary force, its glass rattling in the frame, as someone enters with obvious intent to command attention rather than merely seek service. The newcomer's presence immediately alters the atmosphere, introducing tension where moments before, only quiet satisfaction had existed. Buck Morrison fills the doorway like a storm cloud gathering strength, 45 years old, and carrying himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who has learned to use physical intimidation as a substitute for genuine authority. His expensive clothing and carefully groomed appearance speak of local prosperity, while his manner suggests someone accustomed to having his demands met regardless of their reasonableness or courtesy. Morrison's reputation in the Sedona area extends beyond his legitimate business interests into areas where legal boundaries become matters of interpretation rather than clear definition. His construction company secures contracts through methods that blur the line between aggressive bidding and outright intimidation, while his personal behavior reflects the assumption that wealth and influence exempt him from the social considerations that govern ordinary people. Harry, Morrison announces loudly enough to ensure that everyone present hears his words. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding your lease agreement. Seems to me you might want to reconsider my generous offer before circumstances force me to be less accommodating." The threat, though couched in business language, carries implications that extend far beyond mere commercial negotiation. Morrison's tone suggests that Harry's continued operation of the café depends on acceptance of terms that have nothing to do with fair market value or legitimate business practice. Harry continues his work behind the counter with steady hands that betray no sign of the intimidation Morrison clearly intends to provoke. "Mr. Morrison, my lease runs for another 18 months. I'm current on all payments and compliance requirements. If you have legitimate business to discuss, we can schedule an appropriate meeting." Morrison's expression hardens at Harry's calm resistance to pressure that has proven effective with other local business owners facing similar situations. "You know, Harry, I've been patient with you people long enough. Maybe it's time someone reminded you that certain communities aren't as welcoming as they used to be to folks who don't quite fit in." The racial undertone in Morrison's words transforms casual bullying into something far more serious and personally threatening. Several customers shift uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the ugliness beneath Morrison's carefully chosen language, while feeling uncertain about their obligation to intervene in a situation that could easily escalate beyond their ability to control. Ford observes the developing confrontation with the analytical attention that has served him well in evaluating complex human dynamics both on-screen and in real life. His military experience and years of portraying men who face difficult choices have given him an instinctive understanding of moments when principle demands action despite personal risk or inconvenience. This establishment has always operated according to health department standards and business licensing requirements. Harry responds with quiet dignity that refuses to acknowledge Morrison's attempt to make the conversation about race rather than legitimate business concerns. Any disputes can be addressed through appropriate legal channels. Morrison steps closer to the counter with obvious intent to use his physical presence as an additional form of pressure, his proximity designed to make Harry feel vulnerable and isolated, despite the presence of other customers who might theoretically offer support. "Legal channels take time, Harry. Sometimes business problems require more immediate solutions. Sometimes accidents happen to places that don't maintain proper relationships with people who matter in this community." The threat, though still couched in euphemistic language, clearly crosses the line from aggressive negotiation into intimidation that borders on criminal behavior. Morrison's assumption that no one present will challenge his actions reflects his experience that most people prefer to avoid confrontation even when they recognize injustice. Ford finishes his coffee with deliberate calm, then stands and walks toward the counter with the unhurried pace that characterizes all his movements. His approach attracts Morrison's attention without appearing aggressive or challenging, simply the natural movement of someone completing his business in the café. "Excuse me," Ford says politely as he reaches the counter area where Morrison stands. His voice carries no particular emphasis, just the courtesy of someone requesting passage to complete a routine transaction. Morrison turns to face this potential interference with obvious annoyance at having his intimidation session interrupted by someone who appears oblivious to the serious nature of his business with Harry. "Something you need, friend? This is a private conversation." Ford meets Morrison's gaze with the steady attention that has served him well in countless screen confrontations. His pale blue eyes showing no particular hostility, but also no inclination to be dismissed or redirected. "Just settling my bill with Harry. Seems like a good time to take care of business properly." Morrison studies Ford's appearance, noting the work clothes and desert dust that mark him as another transient laborer, rather than someone whose opinion carries weight in local affairs. "Well, finish up your business and move along. Like I said, this is a private matter." Ford nods politely but makes no move to hurry his transaction, instead turning his attention to Harry with the kind of respectful courtesy that acknowledges the older man's dignity despite the pressure he faces from Morrison's presence. "Excellent meal as always," Ford tells Harry, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet cafe. The kind of service that makes travelers feel welcome and appreciated. worth going out of your way to support. Morrison's frustration becomes visible as he realizes that his attempt to isolate and intimidate Harry faces interference from someone who either doesn't recognize the seriousness of the situation or chooses to ignore it. "Look, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but this doesn't concern you. Why don't you take your business somewhere else?" Ford completes his payment to Harry with careful attention to, including a generous tip that everyone present can observe, his actions speaking louder than words about his assessment of the establishment's value and the character of its operator. Then he turns to face Morrison directly, his movement revealing the controlled grace that marks him as someone comfortable with potential conflict despite his peaceful demeanor. When Ford speaks, his voice remains quiet but carries authority that cannot be manufactured or faked. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Ford says, his tone suggesting helpful clarification rather than confrontation. "Harry here works hard to provide good food and honest service to anyone who walks through that door. That's admirable work that deserves respect." Morrison's anger flares at this direct challenge to his assumption of unopposed authority. "And just who the hell are you to tell me what deserves respect? You're nobody, just another drifter passing through. This is my town, and I'll handle business however I see fit." Ford's expression doesn't change, but something in his stillness suggests that the conversation has moved into territory where careful attention becomes necessary. His hands remain relaxed at his sides, but his posture carries the readiness that marks someone who has learned to prepare for trouble without appearing to seek it. "Your town," Ford repeats thoughtfully, as if considering a concept that requires careful evaluation. "Interesting perspective. Most places I've been, towns belong to everyone who contributes something positive to them. People like Harry, who work hard and treat others with dignity." Morrison steps closer to Ford with obvious intent to use physical intimidation against someone he perceives as an obstacle to his objectives. "You've got a smart mouth for someone who doesn't know the situation around here. Maybe you need to learn when to mind your own business." Ford doesn't step backward or forward, simply maintains his position with the calm certainty of someone who has measured the opposition and found it manageable. "This became my business when you decided to threaten someone who was just trying to do his job. That's not acceptable behavior regardless of who you think you are." The silence that follows Ford's words carries weight that transforms the café, Satmas atmosphere from uncomfortable tension into something approaching genuine danger. Other customers recognize that the situation has moved beyond mere argument into territory where consequences become inevitable, regardless of anyone's preference for peaceful resolution. Morrison makes the mistake that bullies often make when confronted by someone who refuses to be intimidated. He assumes that escalation will restore his advantage, that increased aggression will overwhelm opposition and re-establish his dominance over the situation. "You want to make this personal?" Morrison asks, his voice rising as he attempts to use volume and threat to compensate for his lost psychological advantage. "Because I can make things very uncomfortable for anyone who thinks they can waltz in here and tell me how to handle my business." Ford's response comes not through words but through a subtle shift in positioning that places him between Morrison and Harry, while maintaining the appearance of casual movement rather than deliberate tactical advantage. His presence creates a barrier that Morrison must acknowledge or physically confront. "The only person making this uncomfortable is you," Ford observes quietly. "Harry's been nothing but professional and courteous. You're the one who came in here looking to intimidate someone who's just trying to make an honest living." Morrison's face flushes with anger and embarrassment at having his behavior characterized so directly in front of witnesses who can no longer pretend ignorance about the nature of his actions. "You don't know anything about the situation here. This is business, not some movie where you get to play hero." Ford's slight smile carries no amusement, just recognition of irony that Morrison cannot appreciate. "You're right about one thing. This isn't a movie. In real life, when someone threatens a decent man who's done nothing wrong, other people have an obligation to step up. That's not heroism, it's just basic decency." The confrontation reaches its climax when Morrison realizes that Ford will not be intimidated or dismissed. that his usual tactics have encountered someone whose resolve exceeds his ability to overcome through bluster and threat. His options have narrowed to actual violence or strategic retreat, and something in Ford's calm readiness suggests that violence would prove costly, regardless of its outcome. Morrison attempts one final assertion of authority, moving close enough to Ford that physical contact becomes inevitable unless someone steps back. Last chance to walk away before this gets unpleasant for everyone involved. Ford doesn't retreat, but neither does he advance. He simply exists in the space he has chosen to occupy, his presence creating an immovable obstacle to Morrison's intended intimidation of Harry. When he speaks, his voice carries the finality of someone who has made decisions that will not be reconsidered. The unpleasant part is already over. You came in here to threaten someone who couldn't fight back effectively. Now you're dealing with someone who can. That changes the mathematics considerably. Morrison stares at Ford for several seconds, his mind processing the reality that his usual methods have not only failed, but have exposed him to potential consequences that he cannot control or predict. Ford's calm certainty suggests capabilities that Morrison lacks the courage to test directly. "This isn't over," Morrison finally declares, his voice carrying the hollow defiance of someone who has lost a confrontation but lacks the character to admit defeat gracefully. Ford nods politely. "You're right. It's over when you walk out that door and leave Harry to run his business without interference. That would be the smart choice for everyone concerned." Morrison retreats toward the exit with as much dignity as his circumstances allow, pausing at the door to deliver one final threat that fools no one about who has gained advantage in their confrontation. "You won't always be around to protect your friend," Morrison warns. "This town has a long memory for people who don't know their place." Ford's response follows Morrison to the door. "And this town also has good people who recognize the difference between strength and bullying." Harry's not as alone as you'd like to think. After Morrison's departure, the café returns slowly to its normal rhythm, though the atmosphere carries additional warmth that speaks of community bonds strengthened through shared recognition of principles successfully defended. Ford returns to the counter to address Harry directly. "Sorry about the disruption," Ford says, though his tone suggests no regret about his intervention. "Some people mistake kindness for weakness. Usually costs them more than they expect to pay." Harry's gratitude shows clearly in his expression, though his words remain characteristically understated. "Thank you for standing up when you didn't have to. Not many people would have gotten involved." Ford shakes his head slightly. "Anyone decent would have done the same thing." The problem is that too many people convince themselves that staying out of it is somehow noble. It's not. It's just convenient. As Ford prepares to leave, Harry offers the kind of insight that comes from years of observing human nature in all its varieties. "You handled that like someone who's had practice dealing with troublemakers." Ford's response reflects the modest pragmatism that has guided him through military service and Hollywood success alike. Some skills transfer between different situations. The important thing is knowing when they're needed. Ford exits the café into the gathering twilight, leaving behind a small community that has witnessed something significant about the nature of courage and community responsibility. His intervention will be discussed and remembered, not as entertainment, but as example of principles that matter more than personal convenience. The incident never makes local newspapers or Hollywood gossip columns, existing only in the memories of those who witnessed genuine character demonstrated through action rather than words. For Ford, the confrontation represents nothing more than appropriate response to circumstances that demanded intervention. But for Harry and the other café customers, the evening provides proof that decency still exists in forms that do not require publicity or recognition to maintain their effectiveness. Some heroism happens in roadside cafés rather than movie theaters, and its impact lasts longer than any film. For more stories about Hollywood legends who prove their worth through character demonstrated in private moments, subscribe to Glenn Ford Hidden Legacy.